Okay, after finishing the main shaft yesterday, we're ready to move on to the adapter plate here, get it ready for putting parts back in it. What I've done is I've lifted, these holes have the spacer shim to set the preload on the shafts. And then the race fits on top, lift that out, lift the shim out. Do that on both holes. Then I removed the bolt from here, turn that to the side, lift this assembly up. Now we'll remove the seals, the input shaft seal there, and then there is 2 seals for the shift shaft. That's the outer one, and there is another one down there in that hole. So I'm going to knock this one out, and then we'll access the second one. And then we need to clean this thing up spotless. Now we're ready to change the bearings on the counter shaft, and then we can put stuff back in here and measure for the bearing preload. And the outer shift seal just pops out. You can just use a screwdriver, pop it out. And down in there is another seal. We'll come in from the other side with a punch and drive it out this direction. And then your input shaft seal, you can take a screwdriver and just drive it back toward the inside. And that will have all the pieces that we need out of the housing to clean it. There is a bushing there that you can replace if you want. I always check to make sure it's a nice tight fit on the shifter shaft. I haven't had to replace any yet. They're just not worn. So check that. Make sure you like it. Otherwise, put a new bushing in it. Today we're going to knock this input shaft seal out. Always keep track of the direction of the seals. The lips go facing in to seal the fluid into the transmission. Don't want to put it in backwards. That's just that easy. And here's the lip I'm talking about. This lip here needs to face inside. The part with the spring, that will face toward your fluid. This will be outside. Now for the little one down in the hole there. It's a little more difficult to get to since you are working down in a hole. Screwdriver might get a better bite on it to knock it out. So be careful with the bore, be careful with your bushing there. There's the spring. And there's the smaller inner seat. Now, if you do end up wanting to change that bushing, now's the time you can drive it out and drive a new one in. Well, I'm going to grab the shifter shaft. That's a nice tight fit. Should be fine. So now it's off to just cleaning this. Brush and some solvent. Get all the silicone off the faceplate. Just make it look like new. Then we'll be ready to start putting stuff together to measure clearances. Another piece that needs to come out, that I forgot to mention a second ago, is this pipe plug. That goes through to right here on the counter shaft bearing area. And what we need to take that out is we'll go ahead and take it out so we can clean thread locker and sealant out of the hole. Well, we reach up through there on the outside with a rod and a dial indicator to check the clearance on the counter shaft. So it's important to go ahead and take that out. Got the adapter plate fairly clean. And if you're like me, I usually like to either pressure wash it or take it to the car wash, pressure wash it there. When you shim these up, you need to bolt the case on temporarily, so it needs to be clean too. So I'm going to take them both out to the car wash at the same time. Basically, the only thing left that we didn't take off earlier was you'll want to pull the two magnets out of the bottom so you don't lose those. The bearing races inside, we'll tap those out once everything's clean. Need to spend pretty good attention on the gasket surfaces is the main thing. You want to get the exterior of the case as clean as possible just to make sure you don't get dirt back in your transmission. I got the adapter plate in the case all nice and cleaned up, so now it's time to start messing with bearings so we can start putting stuff back in the case. This is the input shaft. This is the race that came out of the adapter plate. The shim goes under this. I have the new replacement bearing setting there, so we got to get this old bearing off. Got a separator plate put underneath there. There's not enough room to get under the inner race of the bearing, so we're basically kind of pressing up against the cage, hoping the rollers will catch and push it off. If not, it'll just break the cage, and then we'll have to move in, figure out some other way to push it off there. Back in the press, we'll give it a little shove and see what happens. See what goes wrong. Whoa, we're getting lucky. It wedged the bearings up like I was hoping, just enough to get it pushed off there. Next, we need to take out the race here. So that bearing is off there. We'll press that back on here a little bit. There is a race down in that hole, which corresponds to this bearing on the end of your main shaft, where all that slides together. So, got to figure out. Those are always a pain because it's a blind hole. Very little lip to grab on. I don't even remember how I got the last now, so I'm going to have to figure something out. Okay, in order to get that bearing race out of that blind hole, I took a flat washer, welded a nut onto the bottom, stick the flat washer in the race, buzz the flat washer to the race, screw the bolt down, pull the race right out. That's the easiest way I know of to get it out. And I mean, you may not have a welder, but most car guys, if they don't have a welder, they know somebody that's got a welder. So, real easy job that way. Now we can put a new race in there, put a new bearing on there, and we'll have that part done. And you have a socket that was the right size to fit the race. And in it goes. New race is in. Make sure it's all the way bottomed out, because if it's not, that'll affect the shimming process in a bad way. And one other thing about welding to that, I mean, whoever's welding, it ought to be obvious, but make sure you cover everything else with a wet rag or whatever you want to use, because you don't want any splatter on your gears. You don't want any splatter on these teeth. You just want to make sure you get a little weld in here right to the race. If you do that, everything will be fine. Okay, we're now ready to press that matching bearing onto the bottom of the main shaft. The reason I'm doing it this way instead of the other way, upside down, is because this assembly, remember that O-ring was to hold everything in place? Unless I keep a hand on that, that section will try to slide off the shaft. So it's just easier to do it this way. As I was pressing that on, I had the bearing setting right on the plate. But you got to make sure, see the little bit of gap there? I set it straight on the plate so I could get everything lined up, keep it straight as it pressed on. Now, since the shaft sticks out of the bearing just ever so slightly, we'll have to get a socket and put on the edge here so we can finish pushing it that last little bit up on the shaft. Once again, very important because that affects the shimming. Position the socket on the inner race like this. Gave it one last little push. Popped right up on there. So now it is totally flush up against the main shaft. So that's ready to go back in the input. And now we can go back to working on the input shaft. Here is the new bearing race for it. The new cone. We'll be pressing the cone down on there. But now we're going to take the race over to the adapter plate. And we're going to fit it down in its hole. I'll work on that when I got two hands. But we need that centered down in the bottom. No shims, because we're going to measure the clearance and find out what shim we need. So let's go back and press that cone onto that input shaft. When you feel across this bearing, it feels like the cage is just slightly above the center. So if you laid that on the press plate like that, you'd be pressing on the cage first. Probably would be fine, but I would just as soon press solely on the inner. So what I did was pulled, this is the old bearing, popped the cage loose, rid of the rollers. So we'll set this down on there like so. We'll take that old one, set it like that, and we will press on this piece, and that will shove that down solely by the inner race. Make sure it's totally protected. Okay, it's all positioned in the press. This is pressing solely on the inner race of the bearing. Cage is completely free. I wanted to press on the center down in there, so I've got a little rod here taking up space. Be careful not to nick up your new race inside there. I didn't really want to press on these fingers. As you can see, they're not well supported. Now it's time to just shove it on in there. That is on there. Make sure it's completely bottomed out. All right, now we need to take the race, finish knocking it down into the adapter plate. The race that corresponds to the input shaft. There we go. It is all the way down with no shim, remember. We'll take this. I don't have any of the seals in there or anything yet because there's no need for it. That sets in there like that. Now we can set the main shaft up. When you are putting the main shaft on, make sure these tabs line up with these slots in that gear. All right, we're in there. And now, remove the slider and engage forward. Okay, that can set there now, and we have to put bearings on new bearings on the counter shaft. Put it in here, and then we can slip the case on, bolt together, and check clearance. All right, we got the separator plate bolted back onto this bearing. See if, like before, we can get it shoved out of there. Make sure to keep a hold of the counter shaft in case this stuff lets go in a bad way. You don't want it smacking the floor and breaking a tooth. We're fortunate it's coming right out. There we go. That bearing is off. Didn't want to bore you with too many repetitive bearing removals. So I went ahead and took the old bearing off this end. This is the new bearing going on. Like I did before, I took the cage off the old bearing, and I'm using the inner race as a press piece. We will push this down on there. Just that easy. It is all the way down, so we'll grab the other bearing and press the other end on. Okay, we've got fresh bearings. both ends of the counter shaft. So we'll take the new race that corresponds with the end of the counter shaft that goes in the adapter plate. And we'll put this in the adapter plate just like the main shaft with no shims underneath it. Okay, at this point, got the race in here. We can slip the counter shaft back in just like we took it out. By tilting the main shaft slightly, and it drops in, everything meshes together. So that's set up for testing. Next, the races for these two bearings are in the case. So we need to knock out the old races out of the case, put in the new bearings in the case. And down in there are your two corresponding races. We'll flip it over and we'll drive them out from the other side. We'll drive them out this direction. You can see down there I've got a little bit of gap now. There's just enough lip on those bearings that you can take a punch and work side to side, working it slowly down out of there till it drops out. Do the same thing on the other hole. Just take your time and be careful. Like anything else, pay attention. Make sure you don't gouge up the sides of the case where the races ride. Just work it down. There we go. And once you get the old bearings out, or the old races out, set the new ones in there. We're going to tap them back in place, pretty much like we tapped the old ones out. I have a long piece of aluminum rod that I use for this. And you just work your way side to side, work around it, gently tap it down in there. Make sure whatever you're using to tap it down in there is softer than the race. So aluminum, a long brass punch, just be gentle on it. As long as your punch material is softer than your race, you won't hurt anything. Just make sure you're gentle and get them all the way down in the bore. All right, both of those are in there. I know it may seem kind of crude driving it down in there with that rod, but it works. Doesn't cause any problems. And back when I was a youngster, I was working and I was like 16. Didn't have anybody to teach me anything on how to work on stuff. And I had a 51 Mercury I was messing with. And it had an automatic transmission even back then. And I had a leak there on the tail shaft. So I had to take the tail shaft off of it in the car. That wasn't a problem. Fixed the seal there. Wanted to put a new, the drive shaft seal in. I popped the old one out and all I had to go by was an old Chilton manual. And it said you needed to have special driver, blah, 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 to put that in there. And I'm like, well, crap, I ain't got any of that. And I don't want to mess this up. So there was one transmission shop here in town. Old guy, probably was working on transmissions when that 51 Mercury came out off the assembly line. And I took it in there and said, I need the seal pressed in. And he proceeded to set the housing down on the floor and beat the seal in with a hammer. And charged me $5 for it. And that was quite a bit of money back then. And I was like, well, shit, I'm never having anybody work on anything again. And I haven't. Well, I've wiped all the bearings down, all the races. We're ready to set this case down on top of there. Gasket surfaces are clean, everything's clean. Put that down in there. There we go. The alignment pins lined up. There. Okay, it's all together. I need to go clean the bolts. And then we will bolt this together and torque it to, I believe the service manual said 26 foot-pounds. And then we can check the clearances so we know what shims to put in. Gently tilted the case back. Make sure to hang on to it because it's not glued together, not bolted together. So you need to keep a hand on it, keep it squeezed together, get a couple of bolts in. And then you can set it on back, put the rest of the bolts in, torque them down to 26 foot-pounds. That's per the factory shop manual. Now we are ready to stand it back up and then we can measure for the shims. For this step, you need a dial indicator, a mag base, or some way to hold the dial indicator in position. So I've got that sitting on a piece of I-beam. I just had it laying around, mag base coming up, setting on the shaft. Now, work that shaft around to where it's all the way down, zero out your gauge. I keep getting my hand in. There we go. Zero out your gauge. And then we're going to lift that shaft up and see how much movement it's got. The shaft is all the way down. Gauge is zeroed out. I'm going to go in and grab onto the shaft. I'll grab it down below the view and I'll lift it straight up. $29,000. Now drop it back down. Move it around. It zeroes out because you want that seated down in that bearing. Let's try it again. 29. We're going to call that 29 thousandths. And if you don't have a dial indicator, this stuff is cheap at Harbor Freight. I bought this new, I usually use an analog dial indicator, but I bought this one last night because my other one was getting a little beat up. This was like $30. Mag base, not much more. It's not bad to have if you're going to do this kind of stuff. So 29 thousandths is the clearance that we have right now. And what we want is 2 thousandths of preload. So if we have 29 thousandths of clearance and we want 2 thousandths of preload, we put in a 31 thousandths shim. So that would take the 29 thousandths of clearance out and add 2 thousandths of preload. So I'm going to write that down. We need a 31 thousandths shim for the main shaft. And the range is 0 to 2 thousandths according to the Corvette service manual on the preload. So we'll get as close to 31 as what I can find in my kit. Next up, measuring the clearance on the counter shaft. And it is a little, just slightly more complicated. Same principle, but this shaft doesn't protrude out of the case like the main shaft here. So it's a little bit more difficult to measure. Here I mentioned pulling that plug out the front. Well, that hole goes all the way through the counter shaft. So what we're going to do is we have a piece of threaded rod. I have a little spacer there. That spacer will stick the rod through the hole, through the counter shaft. That spacer will take up the clearance between the adapter plate and the end of the deal, or the end of the counter shaft. And then we've got a nut on the end. And then we'll put a flat washer and a nut on the other side, tighten it down, and that gives us something to pull on to measure that free play. Okay, there is the rod on the adapter plate end. And there's the rod and the flat washer and the nut on the other end. And now we've got something to check the clearance with. So we stand it back up. Since this goes in the one hole on the table, that goes in the other, and that's kind of long, I'll set it on a couple of pieces of 2x4 this time to check this. So got to make sure that's not up against the workbench. You want it vertical so the bearings seat down in the cone like they're supposed to. Okay, basically same setup as before. Dial indicator is on the end of that. It is zeroed out. The end of the counter shaft tool is not touching. So I'm going to reach under here and push up. We get 38 thousandths. Drops down. I like to kind of mess around with it until I find a pretty good average. And call that 37. It's like 37 and a half. So that would mean we would want the counter shaft is preloaded the same as the main shaft at 2 thousandths max, 0 to 2 thousandths. So if it's 37, we would want a 39 thousandths shim. So now we can go over to the shim pile. Here are the shim kits. The Tremec number is TRK T1371. If you order from Bruce at the Gearbox, when you order a bearing kit, you have the option of getting a shim kit. I'd already had 2 shim kits in stock, so I just got the bearings on this last one. But you have that option. But you need a shim kit to be able to set these up right. Here's a 39 thousandths shim, which is what we want for the counter shaft, and this is actually the shim that came out of the transmission, so it'll go right back in. The one that came out of the transmission for the main shaft is a 41, and we need a 31 now with the new shaft and everything, since a lot of stuff's been changed on the main shaft. So we'll dig through the box and see if we can't find a 31. And we found a 30. That'll give it 1 thousandths preload, which is perfectly in spec, right in the middle of spec actually, so we'll use it. At this point we can take the dial indicator off, take the rod out of the counter shaft, unbolt the faceplate, stand it back up, take the case off so we can put the shims in. I've removed all the bolts on the adapter plate except for one at the top. I'm going to gently, where's my, well, my impact can be gently tilted up. Slide it back a little bit. I'm going to squeeze this together here. Pull that last bolt out. Keep a hand on everything. Lift it up and set it back down on its blocks. Now we can pull the case off. Tilt the main. Take out the counter shaft, lift out the main, take out the input. Now we've got our properly sized shims. Work that bearing race up, drop the shim in place, put that back in, and that is set. Same thing with the counter shaft. Line up, shim goes in, and that's the end of your checks on the main and the counter shaft. Because once you bolt it together, you can't measure the preload. So that's why checking the free play and getting the right shim was important. So right now, I think I'm going to end this video here. There is the counter shaft extension needs to be shimmed later on, but you have to have all the rest of this bolted together. Final assembly. Then you can put the counter shaft extension in and shim it before you put the tail housing back on. So right now on this piece, we're down to seals and we can start building it up from here. But that's how you shim it.